Okay, we are continuing our study on the Sermon on the Mount. Last week we wrapped up the area section. A lot of your translations will use the subtitle, The Beatitudes. That goes through verse 12 of chapter 5 of Matthew. And so I think we're ready to move on to more stuff. Now, we're going to get to the next section here, and for at least the first few bits here, it's still going to be under part 1 of kind of what I've designated as the attributes of the righteous. And there'll be quite a bit of things. Well, that and Jesus' fulfillment of the law. And that's one of those things where I could really put it in part 1 or 2 because it actually has applications to both parts. So it's not a clean fit. I'll obviously admit that. But let's start doing Matthew chapter 5. If I get someone to read for us verses 13 through 16, and then we'll kind of talk about that. Whoever's there, Matthew 5, 13 through 16, please. Okay. Probably most of us are very familiar with this set of verses. My mother has this phrase. I don't assume that she made it up. She's not that creative. But she's the only person I've ever heard say it. She when she's talking about people who are very good, good-natured people, very helpful, very humble, she calls them salt of the earth people. I'm sure that's a phrase that's come from somewhere. She's the only person I've ever heard say that, but I know what she means by that. This is what we're talking about. The salt of the earth people are like this. And I kind of look at this as, this is what, the Beatitudes, these people who are meek, who are seeking righteousness, who are persecuted because of their righteousness, all those things we've gone through the last couple of weeks. I think Jesus is saying, you are the light, you are the salt of the earth to these kind of people. And I think a lot of the people who are like that are probably in this crowd here that have come to hear what Jesus has to say. Because remember, he's not like in a very convenient place where everyone just happens to be. People have journeyed to go and hear him speak. And it's not like they just hop in their car and be there in 5 minutes. Most of them have probably walked there. I mean, they spent time, effort, resources, economic opportunity cost to be there before Jesus. They have something that they're looking for in the things that they've heard about him. And he now is saying, you are the light of the world. You are the salt of the earth. I think in many ways, he's probably talking to these people directly. You guys have this light. You have this salt. You have this potential to be all these things that he's talked about and will continue to talk about, but also comes with a warning. You are the light. But if you hide that light, what good is it? You are the salt of the earth, but if the purpose of the salt is lost, well, it's not really good for anything anymore. And so there's sort of this duality that he's doing. He's encouraging the people. He's saying, kind of all these uplifting things about you're the light, you're the salt, and that sounds great, but also don't lose that. So it's a very powerful thing here, and this is why I think this set of verses is so powerful and so effective, is because he's doing these things. So he's conveying pretty much the same message twice here. When he talks about the light and the salt of the earth, we're not going to say, okay, what's the salt and what's light? He's saying the same thing 2 different ways. This is a very common thing. Paul does this all the time. You see this in the Old Testament when especially in the Proverbs, Solomon will say a lot of the things that he's trying to convey in many different ways. It's not like he's saying completely new topics here. He's using slightly different ways to describe the same thing or talk about the same topic, which is what Jesus is doing here, I believe. So the idea here is that your righteousness should be evident to those around you. You should not have this righteousness that's hidden, that is not affecting anybody, that there's sort of this wall or hedge around you and your righteousness stays within those borders and no one else is affected by it. It's going to be evident. It's going to be seen if you're doing it correctly. And Jesus is talking about the value that both the salt and the light have. But again, if they are squandered, they no longer retain that value or that use. So you could ask, why is Jesus choosing to express this idea at this point in his message? Because this has been one of the big things I've talked about. Like, why is Jesus saying these things to these people now? Why is he now saying these words between the Beatitudes and then talking about the fulfillment of the law and then going on to other things? So I'm obviously splitting hairs here. It's like, well, it doesn't really matter. It's a great message for any point, probably. But I think there is a purpose in why he's choosing to put it here. Remember that Jesus has just finished telling the people that those who follow him will be persecuted. Not if or, possibly or a good chance, will be persecuted. And we've gone to other verses that talk about that. And now here he's encouraging them, don't hide your righteousness. You will be persecuted because of your righteousness, but that does not mean you hide it. So in a way, he's kind of shoring up maybe some of the thoughts in the people's minds after they've heard him say, blessed are the righteous who are persecuted because of righteous, or blessed are those who are persecuted because of me. And they're thinking, well, I'll take this Jesus teaching stuff and I'll keep it to myself. That way I'll be all right. I'll kind of safeguard myself. Jesus is saying, don't do that. Don't hide it. Don't keep it to yourself. That's sort of eliminating the point of what we're trying to do. So he's encouraging them not to hide their righteousness, which in a way would maybe help them avoid persecution. But then that righteousness is going to come to nothing. It's not going to have that value. It's going to be the salt that loses its saltiness. It's going to be that light that is then hidden under a bowl. It's not going to be useful. So he's saying, don't do that. In a way, don't do this to avoid persecution. You're going to essentially waste everything that you are earning. So Jesus says to let our light shine before others that they may see the good deeds and glorify God. And if we follow Christ, that is evident to others. There's a draw to those who see that and say, well, there's something different about that. I need to know more about this. And we see examples of that all over the New Testament. You probably have personal anecdotes that are like that, that you could tell. Now, Peter is going to say very similar things in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12, encouraging Christians to live good lives among the pagans, and they'll see those good deeds. If someone read that for us real quick, because I don't think my explanation does justice. Somebody read 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12, just verse 12. How many times did Paul go to a city and get chased out or persecuted or mob rushed, or take your pick of all the persecutions he endured? Yet there were some people there that would believe and a church would be started there. Now that sounds like, well, he went through a whole lot of trouble, but souls are saved. There is going to be some trial, there's going to be persecution, but you need to live that good life so that others can see it, so you can be an example for them. Even people who don't really understand maybe the basic concepts of God will see you and say, hey, I want to know more about that. Now, before we move on and take questions about this or comments, I want to do one thing, which is to clarify what the righteousness before men is here that he's talking about. So he says, in verse 16, in the same way, shine your light before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. He's saying that's a good thing to do. I agree. But there needs to be sort of this line between living righteously and glorifying God and encouraging others to do so, and on the other side, doing these acts of righteousness in order to be praised by other people. Now, this is going to come up later. Jesus is going to talk about this in Matthew chapter 6, verse 1, where he talks about, those who are giving to the needy. They make a big show of it so everyone can see that, hey, look, I'm giving to this person who's in need. Look how great and righteous I am. Or those who go out into the marketplaces and pray before all the people so they can see how righteous they are. That's not what Jesus is talking about here in chapter 5. And he's going to criticize that kind of thing in chapter 6. We'll get more on that in a bit. But there's a difference here. Jesus is saying, don't hide your righteousness. But then in verse 6, he's going to say, basically, don't use your righteousness or your self-righteousness, which is what it becomes after a point, to make yourself praised by men, to make yourself more honorable before the eyes of men. That is a very dangerous thing. He's going to say later on, if you do that for the purpose of being seen by men, you've got your reward right there. That's all you're going to get. So we'll obviously get into that a lot more when we get into chapter 6. But understand that the righteousness that Jesus is talking about here in chapter 5 in these verses is true godly righteousness, not the creating self-righteousness in society before men, as you'll see in chapter 6. And Jesus will really lay into, because that sort of thing was happening. I mean, we see that kind of stuff today. We know that this is something that happens, and we need to be very careful of that. Even, I go back to one of my favorite non-biblical books, Plato's Republic, where Socrates and Glaucon come to this idea of what would a perfectly righteous man look like, while a perfectly unrighteous man would have all of the trappings and the honor of a righteous man, but truly he is actually unrighteous. He's doing these things just to be honored. That sounds like a Pharisee. And then they talk about a truly righteous man would have no reputation for righteous, although he truly is, he will eventually be put to death and impaled. And that sounds a lot like Jesus. So you have this dynamic that even logically people of ancient time beforehand have sort of talked about. This would not be a completely new idea, but this is radical to what they have seen in the Jewish leadership. So Jesus is going to get into that in Matthew chapter 6. So I'll get more on that, but I did want to mention it here because some people say, well, this is a contradiction, because you see here in chapter 5, Jesus is saying, let your light shine, let your righteousness be seen. But then in chapter 6, he's saying, well, don't do that. That's not a contradiction. Jesus is saying this is where it needs to be. He's narrowing it down so you understand exactly what you're doing here. Not going into that self-righteous acts, that gaining honor before men sort of thing that Jesus will talk about more in chapter 6. Comments, thoughts, questions about this section of verses in chapter 5. Go ahead, Gretchen.
Curious what you would think is if someone was giving a large donation, one we could do, would you think that doing it anonymously would be not as good as doing it, showing who did it? I mean, if you are a righteous person and you are,
if you're doing it anonymously, because you're not doing it to be seen. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question there.
Well, I'm just thinking, do you think Christ would think it would be better for some billionaire to show they gave $1 million to this particular fund that we would maybe approve of personally in our church? I mean, I'm just curious what you thought.
Well, you're going to get me in the weeds here. Not too bad. So I'll say this, because I'm not going to pretend to know how people with vast amounts of wealth want to manage it, because I'm not in that headspace. I can't even begin to understand a lot of that. But I would say giving anonymously and not getting on the news because of it would probably be a better act. I would think that Jesus would also say, hey, you should be doing the more important things of life before you just say, well, I maybe anonymously gave a donation, now I'm set. Because doing that will not be your salvation. I just want to make that clear, because there are some who have this idea, well, I've amassed all this wealth, and we get here in places like Matthew chapter 6 where I shouldn't make a show of it, so I'll just donate a whole bunch of money to a church or religious organization, and it'll be a whole lot of money, and they'll solve all those problems, but they're not doing all the other things. And Jesus lays into the Pharisees about that. Like, they give their tenth, they tithe, but they're not having justice in the courts. They're not loving their neighbor. They're short in so many actual righteous acts. Jesus is basically saying there's nowhere for you in the kingdom of heaven, because you should be doing your tithing. You should be doing those things are good, but you're not doing the more important things. And this is something that comes up in the Old Testament, where you have the Israelites who are offering sacrifices. They're doing all the things they're supposed to be doing, but God says, their lips, they're praising me, but their hearts are far from me. As soon as they get away from the temple, what are they doing? They're murdering their neighbor. They're stealing from one another. They're taking advantage of the poor. They're perverting justice in the courts. Those things are more important than offering a sacrifice. Should they have offered the sacrifice? Yes, but don't neglect these other more important things of actual righteous acts. So I don't know if I am answering your question there, but that's really kind of where I would think Jesus would say is maybe it would be better to offer anonymously, but that is not worth anything if you don't have love first. And Paul says that in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, where he says, if I give all my money to the poor and have not love, it's nothing. It's meaningless. I've done essentially no good because I myself have not done any righteousness. Any follow-up on that? Or
brought up one time, many months ago, that I guess, and maybe specifically Americans, but maybe others too, that there were more people who was like, yeah, let me give money so I don't have to give my time and service and so forth. So, and then when we look at it, I hate to say it, but I know one time Jeff Bezos gave some, not like he's some righteous guy, but he gave, but it was like, it would be like one of us giving $5. It's like, it's not a big deal to us.
yeah. And again, probably another example you could use is when Jesus is observing the people who are giving at the temple, and you have the widow who gives just her 2 mites, the 2 copper coins. But all these other guys have come in, and he says they're giving it out of their wealth. They're giving a higher number, but it's not worth as much to the Lord because they're not losing anything out of it. There's not really a sacrifice there for them. This widow's giving everything she has. Yeah, we could get on all the legal code about that, but I think the important thing is, what are you doing as a person? Are you going and helping your neighbor? Are you loving one another? Are you committing yourself to the righteousness that God has asked us to, or are you just writing a check and saying, I'm good now? Arnold and then Jeff.
Yes, I want to just sort of mention that when you're giving, as the Bible tells you, the purpose, you purpose what you're going to give. And is it out of the abundance that God has blessed you with?
Mm.
So, we can't outgive God. So, this is something that you don't need to shout on the rooftops about.
Yeah, and well, again, I'll get more into that when we get to chapter 6. Not that I don't mind talking about this now, but this was a problem in the time of Jesus, and this is one of the reasons why he's going to address that later on. Go ahead, Jeff.
Just want to mention the qualities we're all familiar with of salt are really interesting. That it's a preservative, it's something that helps food taste better, and it's necessary for life.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting here that he says that if the salt loses its seasoning ability, it still has a use. You throw it out and let it be trampled on by the feet of men. And I think there's a sense in which our influence, if it is not good and righteous, there still will be a use for our influence, and that is as a negative example. We will either be positive or negative, but we will not be without, we will not go through this life without leaving a spiritual footprint.
Yeah.
We will make it, there'll be a weight behind us, and we have to think about that and ask about our children and their memories of us, about our other friends that we have, and do they genuinely appreciate us because we make their life better, because we try to be a good example. So a lot in salt in life that we could think about in terms of our daily conduct.
Yeah, and I think the value of salt and light is maybe lost upon us in the modern time. You think about salt and we're like, oh yeah, it makes my soup taste a little better maybe. Let me tell you, before the time of refrigeration, you had to have salt to preserve meat. There was not really a better way to do it. Salt was extremely valuable in that time. So if you had a salt mine or some deposit that you could pull from, you could earn a lot of money off of that salt because everyone was using it. It was a common item that everyone, there's just constant demand all the time. That demand never went away. I mean, it's equivalent to just having, I would say, like if you were an energy utility, everyone's using the power, you constantly have a demand for your supply. So salt was extremely valuable up until really modern time. I mean, it still is valuable, but you get into the 1950s when refrigeration starts to become much more common. You could say maybe that was about the point where salt was not seen as important as it was then, but for most of human history, salt has been an extremely important resource. Light also. I mean, we have all these light bulbs in here. We can see really well. It's almost like daytime in here. But in way back when, either if you were going to have artificial light or not naturally made light, not sunlight, I guess I'll say that, you had to have some oil that you could burn, and you had to have all these other resources. How am I going to make this fire started? What are all the things I'm going to burn? You have to literally burn money in a way that is super inefficient. Oil was extremely expensive. That's another thing that was commonly needed at the time. There was always a demand for it. These things were not valueless. I mean, we think of these things as, oh, these are common items today. This is not a big deal. This is very symbolic. But when Jesus is saying these words at this time, the people understand, oh, this is a very valuable resource. And if that's squandered, I mean, we're really, really wasting a lot of things here. We would not do that. A common person would not waste those things. So I think the message is maybe stronger for those people at that point, and maybe we don't quite understand, or maybe we understand in a way, but we can never really feel it because we're not living in that time period when those things were so much more in demand and required than they are today. You have a follow-up, Jeff?
One of the things, you're talking about the fact that salt is abundant and cheap. And I think there's a parallel in the sense that every person can be a good influence if he or she is willing. Doesn't cost you a lot of money, costs you a little bit of time and some personal sacrifice could be interested in others and show thought to your decisions, that you set a good example. But everybody can do it. And if I don't do it, it's on me. And it's not just because life is hard. Life is hard on everybody. And there's no excuses for me to justify not being a good person. God has created me with abilities. God has created me with opportunities. And I need to be thinking about the choices that I make so that I set good examples.
Yeah, agreed. Any other comments on this section? Okay, I'm going to move on then. Let's get someone to read for us Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through 20, please.
Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, not one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled. Whoever therefore breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches men so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven.
Okay. This is a really interesting, and again, this is a section of verses I was not sure where I wanted to really place this in part 1 or part 2. You can really put it in either one. There's a lot of really important stuff that Jesus is saying here that, to me, should have been obvious, but the fact that he feels that it's necessary for him to say reflects not only kind of the mindset of the people, but also like what was going to be the fallout from all these things that Jesus is saying. He is taking time here because I think a lot of the things that people will hear, if they're not paying attention, if they're not really thinking about what he's saying, they're going to say, well, this is really radical stuff that Jesus is preaching here. This is out there. He's saying some things that I'm not so sure about. And we get sections where we'll see that, where Jesus tells about, eating his body and drinking his blood, and people are like, well, I'm done with that, because they're not understanding what he's talking about. And so Jesus is giving sort of a reassurance here that his goal is not to wipe away the law and the prophets and get rid of that and destroy it, because that was no good. He's saying, I've come here to bring it to completion. Your translations will say fulfillment, perfection, completion. When you look at the law, when you look at the prophets and all the things they're talking about, they're always talking about this missing piece, if you will, that is on its way, especially in the prophets. Almost every single prophet, not every single one, but almost all of them, will talk about the coming of the kingdom of heaven, or the new kingdom of God, or the Messiah, something about that, an eternal kingdom that will not be destroyed. It's always pointing forward to something. And Jesus is trying to kind of let people know that here's the completion, it's coming. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is near. He's been saying this. John the Baptist has been saying this. It's coming. So he's not here to say that all this stuff that came before, that's no good, get rid of it. Here now listen to my teaching that's superior in every single way, which it is, but it is because it's built upon those things, not because it is destroying those things, as he says. So he's kind of giving some reassurance here that he's not come to destroy the law or the prophets. He's going to bring them to completion. Now, Jesus obviously will challenge many of the traditions, and the Pharisees will call him out on this, like, hey, why are your disciples not doing this? Or why have you done that? How dare you heal on the Sabbath? All these other things. But Jesus never violates the law. And when you look at the prophets of the Old Testament, he is going through and he is fulfilling those prophecies. He is turning people back to God in the way that those prophets spoke about that, the way that God really wanted him to be, really wanted the people to serve him. He is the coming of the Christ, the Messiah. Now, I have a whole list of verses I want to go to that kind of expand upon this, where people are talking about Jesus and the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. So we're going to go to a few separate places. Someone go to Luke chapter 24, verses 36 through 48. Someone go to John chapter 1, verses 43 through 51. And then the third one we'll look at, someone go to Acts chapter 28, verses 17 through 27. We're going to read through all these, and you'll see how people talk about Jesus' fulfillment of the law and the prophets. But it's in various contexts. We'll kind of talk about them all together once we read them. But let's go to the first one, whoever's there. Luke chapter 24, verse 36 through 48, please.
Now as they said these things, Jesus himself stood in the midst of them and said to them, "Peace to you." But they were terrified and frightened and supposed they would have seen a spirit. He said to them, "Why are you troubled? Why do doubts arise in your hearts? Behold my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Handle me and see, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones as you see I have." When he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. But while they still did not believe for joy and marveled, he said to them, "Have you any food here?" So they gave him a piece of broiled fish and some honeycomb, and he took it and ate in their presence. Then he said to them, "These are the words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, and that all things must be fulfilled which are written in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms concerning me." And he opened their understanding that they might comprehend the scriptures. Then he said to them, "Thus it is written, and thus it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead the third day, and that repentance and remission of sins should be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. You are witnesses of these things."
Thank you. Next one, John chapter 1, verses 43 through 51, please, whoever's there.
The following day, Jesus wanted to go to Galilee, and he found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." And Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" And Philip said to him, "Come and see." Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said to him, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom is no guile." Nathanael said to him, "How do you know me?" Jesus answered and said to him, "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." Nathanael answered and said to him, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus answered and said to him, "Because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these." And he said to him, "Most assuredly I say to you, hereafter you shall see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man."
Thank you. And the last one, someone will read for us Acts chapter 28, verses 17 through 27.
3 days later, he called together the leaders of the Jews. When they had assembled, Paul said to them, "My brethren, although I have done nothing against the people, our people, or against the customs of our ancestors, I was arrested in Jerusalem and handed over to the Romans. They examined me and wanted to release me, but I was not guilty of any crime deserving death. But when the Jews objected, for this people's heart has become callous. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them.
Thank you. Okay. So I wanted to look at these because these all talk about Jesus and him being the fulfillment of, it specifically will mention the law and the prophets. And that's why I wanted to go at those specifically, because they specifically mention those two things. And you have different contexts here. You have one, the one from Luke chapter 24. Jesus has died. He rose from the grave. He's among his disciples. And he's saying, now you understand how I've fulfilled these things. And then they understand it. You look at John chapter 1, you have Philip telling Nathanael, hey, we've found the one that the law of Moses and the prophets are talking about. And Nathanael's a little unsure about that for sure, but he's convinced by Jesus. He's like, yeah, you are the king of Israel. Then you have in Acts chapter 28 where Paul has been sent to Rome. He calls some of the Jewish leaders who are in that area together, and he's talking about Jesus using the law of Moses and the prophets as the starting point. Let me convince you about this man named Jesus who we all believe in because of what's said in the law and the prophets. Some of them are like, okay, we're convinced. Some of them don't. And then he quotes Isaiah about that, which is kind of a double thing on the prophets. So the prophets really kind of understood how this was going to go down, or at least they said the things that were going to go down. Maybe they didn't quite understand it, but we have all these different contexts where we see people talking about this is Jesus being the fulfillment of these things. So when Jesus says this also in Matthew chapter 5, and he's saying, I'm not coming to get rid of these things, I'm coming to bring them to completion. This is what we're talking about. When I think to his credit, both Philip and Nathanael, to both their credits, Philip is the one who says, we know this is the one who the law of the Moses and the prophets have talked about. Nathanael is unsure. He is convinced after talking to Jesus for a very little while about that. And Jesus talks about has fulfillment has come to be in Luke chapter 24 after he's risen from the grave. Basically, all things are complete at that point as far as the work that Jesus had to do on the earth. And then Paul talks about it way later in Acts chapter 28 and convinces several of the Jews there using the law and the prophets to talk about Jesus. So I think that's all great. It all comes together. So what Jesus is saying here in Matthew chapter 5 is not some stray word or thing that he just mentions casually. This comes up over and over in scriptures and other places. And other scriptures we could add to this that talk about it, but they may not use that exact phrasing or wording, so I didn't go to those. But in those three specifically, it's very clear that people understood, okay, now we understand this is the fulfillment through Jesus. Go ahead, Jeff.
There seems to be a likeness between destroying and fulfilling in the sense that whatever you've been doing, you stop. So if a person's baking a cake, they get all their utensils out and everything, and they bake the cake. When they're through, we generally clean up the utensils and put them away. We don't usually just leave them out, they're in the way and everything like that. When you get through cutting your grass, you put your lawnmower away. And so fulfilling, a lot of people, when Paul was telling the Jews that the Gentiles would be included, they'd not be circumcised, they interpreted that as Paul trying to destroy the law. But Paul was not destroying the law, he was fulfilling the law. And so the Jews struggled with that concept. We need to understand that in the same sense that Christ fulfills our purpose in a new and better way in the New Testament. He is not trying to destroy our happiness. He's not trying to destroy what we want out of life. We can get a lot of joy. In fact, we can get the best joy out of fulfilling our purpose, even if it means sacrifices and things like that we make continually. God's not trying to destroy our time here. He's trying to make it best and make us the best version for our life.
Yeah, and I guess another kind of metaphor you could use if you're having someone construct a house and you get all the framing and the roofing and all that's ready to go. Foundation was laid a long time ago. Then it's time to do the interior decorating, get it really all done. The guy who's doing the interior of the building is not going to start knocking out walls. That's not his job. He's going to bring it to completion. But in either case, it is going to be stopped. So I like that analogy you use. There's probably several others we could use also. You also bring up the issue that the Jews had with the Gentiles also being brought in. We know this was a problem. We look at many places in Acts where this whole question of, do they need to be circumcised? Do they need to follow the old law? What foods do they have to abstain from? This comes up a lot. If you remember our last study, we went back to this multiple times. It should have been something that was settled quickly and easily, but it wasn't. They had to keep coming back to this and saying, no, you're not required as a Gentile to come under the old law. You're under the law of Christ. And a lot of the Jews, and I think even some of the good-meaning Jews, struggled with this, probably more so than we can understand, because they were raised in this. This is what they understood. This is what they knew. A lot of us probably didn't have that same background, so it was a difficult thing. But when you look at the entirety of what Jesus is doing, you get to see, okay, he's completing, he's bringing the law of Moses and the prophets to completion. That's not getting rid of it. That's fulfilling it. It's two different things. I think a lot of the Pharisees and his other critics would say, well, this Jesus guy is not holding the old law. He's doing all these other things, but he wasn't violating the law. He was making sure that he was in alignment with the law. He was challenging the traditions of the Pharisees, the things that they were holding on to that were not really part of the old law. So Jesus is calling the people to follow after God faithfully, here with complete obedience, seeking the righteousness of God to the fullest extent. And he tells them that their righteousness must surpass that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. Now, you think about someone who's listening to Jesus at this time, and Jesus is telling you, hey, if you want to be in the kingdom of God, you want to be high up in my kingdom, your righteousness has to be above the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. And some people are probably like, wow, there's no way I can do that. That's such a high bar. But it's because of what a lot of the outward stuff was. What were the Pharisees doing? They were putting themselves in places of honor. They were doing the things that we'll get to in chapter 6, making a show of, hey, look, I'm giving to the needy person over here. All this wealth, that I'm going to make them all right. Or let me pray really loudly in the marketplace so you can all hear these great words that I'm saying to the Lord. That quickly ceases to be righteousness of God and becomes their own self-righteousness. So when Jesus is saying your righteousness must be above theirs, it's really not as high a bar as we really should think it is. He is not giving them an impossible task. He's basically telling them, don't be hypocrites. Be true. Be righteous in a genuine way, not to make yourself look great before men so that they all praise you for being righteous. Be righteous before God. And that's really what he's telling them to do in maybe not so many words. But I can imagine someone who's hearing this like, wow, I know these Pharisees. They seem so righteous. How could I possibly do this? But then you look at what Jesus is going to say in the next sections, which we won't get to this week. But starting in verse 21, after that, he's going to say, you've heard it say this. Here's what you need to really be doing to make sure you're righteous. And we'll talk about those one at a time as we go through them. But he's going to teach them how to have a truly godly righteousness. Not Pharisee righteousness that's over here that looks really good. He's going to teach them how to be truly righteous in the sight of God. And guess what? That's the one that matters. It's not how much praise you get from the people on the street for being good. It's where do you sit with God? What is your relationship with the Lord? We're not just here to be checking off a list like so many times they were doing, but we need to be here actually doing acts of righteousness, having a heart that's pure, devoted to serving. So that's where I'm getting with that. Arnold, I'll let you have a comment in there real quick before we close.
Yeah, I was just going to mention that the Jews, were listening to the prophets, but at the same time, they didn't want to hear what they had to say. So concerning Jesus, and so here in Acts 28, he's telling them, you go here, but you're really not listening. And you're really not going to understand. So God gave them over to just that
Yeah, and that's sort of part of what Paul was quoting Isaiah from in Acts chapter in chapter 28, when like you'll always be hearing but never understanding, you'll always be looking but never seeing. Like they had it right there in front of them, and the scribes, the teachers of the law poured over it daily, but it was really the true understanding was blocked off to them because of their own self-righteous opinion of themselves, I guess you could say. Because, oh, I'm so great because I do this, and this. I must be truly righteous in God's eyes. But then what does Jesus say about them later? And then that throws their whole world upside down. They say, well, we can't accept this Jesus guy because he's saying all these bad things about us. That can't be right. And so they start to find fault with him, and they have trouble with that. Now, there were some, I'm not going to say all Pharisees were like that, because there are examples of some who were convinced. I think Nicodemus is a decent example of that. They came over and they understood by the time Jesus had done everything, this is really what I should be doing. This is the man I should be following. So, yeah, but you have many of them who they've kind of already got an opinion on what they think the prophets are talking about. And when the reality does not reach their expectation, well, that can't be right. Jeff, you had your hand up.
It's interesting when bad guys get in the leadership of religions. Everybody knew the Pharisees were bad guys. They look good, but people saw through their facade to the reality that they were not good people. What happens if this is why leaven in the church can be so dangerous. When hypocrisy is rampant and when leaders don't or not willing to lift a finger to do what they say needs to be done, of course, righteousness, it has a very dilatory effect upon the congregation or people who listen to them. That's why sometimes we leave a church and go to what we consider an unfaithful church and go to a faithful church, because we know that if we continue to allow ourselves to be exposed to hypocrisy, it discourages, first of all, but eventually it can corrupt our thinking. So people are saying, these are bad guys, but God doesn't strike them down. God's not, through his providence, removing them or getting them fired. He tolerates them. Well, maybe they're not all that bad.
Well, and a lot of them are wealthy and in high status, yeah.
So it gets mixed in with this idea that good things come to good people. I mean, it doesn't always work out that way.
Yeah.
And we need to have our mind focused on the truth and not on these ancillary things that are not part of the real topic of righteousness.
Yeah, and it would be easy for us to say, well, this is something that happened over hundreds of years, and it took a lot of time for them to develop these traditions, and it got in the way of actually serving God the way they were supposed to. But how soon after the church gets started do they start warning about false teachers, leaders who are not going to serve the church the way they're supposed to? Pretty much right away. I mean, right away, as soon as the church is established in a place, you start seeing there's problems going on. I mean, Paul warned about this. Peter warned about this. There were already problems going on with false teachers who were coming in and trying to mess up things, or leaders who were of the church who kind of went off their own path, glorified themselves, kind of solidified power under them. I mean, you kind of see that in other religious organizations today. That happens all the time. That's not what Jesus is calling them to do. This is not about trying to put yourself on a pedestal to look a certain way so that the eyes of men see you and you can be understood to be a righteous person in their eyes. It's about, are you doing the things that God actually asks you to? Are you actually loving your neighbor, loving the Lord with all your heart, all your mind, all your strength, all that, on which the entire law and the prophets is upon? Are you even doing those things? And there's probably more of that we're going to talk about as we continue on. And we're way out of time, so I'm going to stop there. When we start next week, we're going to start at verse 21 of chapter 5 of Matthew. And we're going to get really into the meat of part 2, which is the actions of the righteous. And that'll go through chapter 6, verse 18. Jesus is going to go through a whole bunch of topics. And as we read through them, one of the things I want you to notice is that what he starts with is not really the issue. So I'll give you kind of a hint on this, a light for next week. He begins talking about murder in verse 21. The whole point of what he has to say really doesn't have to do with murder. It's everything else before that. And you're going to see that every single topic he's going to touch upon is what's coming before that. Where's the real righteousness at in these things? And so we're going to see a pattern there. It's going to be very obvious as we go through them. But a lot of these translations, including my own, starting in verse 21, the subtitle is murder. Murder is not really the subject of what Jesus is saying in that section. But that's what he starts with. So, but we'll get to all those things. But we'll have to save it for next week.